On the night of the 27th of May, 1965, Indonesian state radio broadcast an announcement to the people of Indonesia. 23 soldiers of the Indonesian Armed Forces had been killed that day in an accident during a training exercise. It was a tragedy. It was regrettable. It was a lie. On a bend of a jungle river called the Sungei Koemba, inside Indonesian sovereign territory, 2 platoons of Australian infantry had lain in silence on a riverbank for 40 minutes, and then destroyed 4 boats and every man aboard them, in an engagement lasting 2 minutes from first shot to last. Here is the part that should stop you where you stand. The Australian government was lying about it too. Every patrol that crossed that border came home to 2 written reports, one describing what the men had actually done, and one describing a fictional patrol that had walked in circles inside Malaysia for a fortnight, and it was the fiction that went to Canberra. Visiting members of Parliament were shown doctored maps. Soldiers were forbidden to discuss their missions with anyone, including the men in the platoon sleeping 10 feet away. They were bound by the British Official Secrets Act for 3 decades, and they obeyed so completely that when the gag finally expired in 1996, veterans were still telling researchers that their platoon had been the only one to go over the border. Not one of them knew that everyone had. Tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of Operation Claret before today? Because you are about to discover the story of a war Australia fought, won, and then agreed never to have fought at all. Now let's go. To understand how Australian soldiers ended up conducting deniable raids into the territory of a country their government was still exchanging ambassadors with, you have to understand what Konfrontasi actually was, and why nobody on either side could afford to call it a war. The surface version is simple enough. In 1963, Britain moved to federate its remaining possessions in the region, joining Malaya, Singapore, Sabah, and Sarawak into a single state called Malaysia. The Indonesian president, Ahmed Sukarno, declared the new federation a neo-colonial fraud, an imperial arrangement dressed as independence, and announced that he would crush it. There followed 4 years of border raids, seaborne landings, airborne incursions, sabotage and bombings, conducted by Indonesian regular soldiers, Marines, paracommandos, and locally recruited irregulars against a British Commonwealth force defending a frontier running more than 1,000 miles through some of the least penetrable terrain on the planet. It was fought at company scale and below. It killed hundreds. Throughout all of it, Indonesia and the countries fighting Indonesia maintained full diplomatic relations because neither side had ever declared anything. Sukarno's reasons were not purely ideological, though the ideology was real enough. He had just concluded a successful campaign to force the Dutch out of West Irian, and the machinery of national mobilization he had built for it was still running with nowhere to point itself. The deeper cause, though, was domestic. His economy was collapsing. His alliance with the Indonesian Communist Party was deepening. His relationship with his own anti-communist generals was corroding, and his power rested on the existence of an external enemy that could absorb the attention of 100 million people who were becoming poorer every month. He cut off American aid. He withdrew Indonesia from the United Nations and aligned himself with Peking. In June of 1964, he told a crowd that Malaysia would be crushed by cock crow on the 1st of January, 1965. He was, in the most literal sense, a man who needed a war more than he needed to win one. The shooting began before the Federation existed. On the 8th of December, 1962, an insurrection broke out in the oil-rich British Protectorate of Brunei, intended to prevent Brunei joining Malaysia and to bring the whole of northern Borneo under a single state. It was crushed within weeks, though not cheaply. At Limbang in Sarawak, the rebels held European hostages and had announced their intention to kill them, and Royal Marines of 42 Commando went in by rivercraft to take the town, losing 5 men to get the hostages out. The British general running the manhunt that followed looked at what he was clearing up and concluded it was not the end of anything. It was a rehearsal. Major General Walter Walker had commanded a brigade during one of the closing operations of the Malayan emergency, and he understood better than almost anyone alive how a jungle frontier is actually held. On the 12th of April, 1963, a party of armed men attacked the police post at Tebedu in the 1st Division of Sarawak, and when the evidence came in, it showed the operation had been conducted by Indonesian soldiers. That finding changed the character of the threat completely. Walker had 5 battalions to cover a border longer than the distance from London to Athens, across a landmass the size of England and Scotland combined, with no roads, no railways, and almost no reliable maps. His answer became the model of British counterinsurgency doctrine, and it rested on 3 principles: win the loyalty of the border tribes, integrate the military with the civil authorities and the police, and put intelligence gathering above every other consideration. He confiscated 8,000 of the 8,500 licensed firearms in Borneo. He recruited border scouts from the Longhouses. He put 4-man patrols of the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment into villages for months at a time, living among the Iban and the Marut and the Kelabit, learning the languages, treating the sick, and listening. The strategy was nearly destroyed in its first year by an atrocity, and then rescued by the same atrocity. On the 28th of September, 1963, a raiding party of roughly 200 Indonesians attacked the Longhouse at Long Jawi, held by 6 Gurkhas, 3 policemen, and 21 border scouts. 5 of the defenders were killed and 7 border scouts taken prisoner. The Indonesians then murdered them. That decision cost Indonesia the war it had not yet properly started. The border tribes had no particular loyalty to Kuala Lumpur and no reason to love the British either. But the killing of unarmed prisoners taken from their own longhouses ended whatever sympathy Indonesia had enjoyed in the interior, and ended it for good. Through 1964, the enemy changed shape. Indonesian Marines assaulted a Malaysian company position at Calabakan in Sabah. Indonesian agents set off 13 explosions in Singapore between March and May. On the 17th of August, a combined force of guerrillas and Marines landed by sea on the Johor coast of the Malayan mainland, intending to start a revolution, and the local people helped the security forces round them up instead. An airborne landing 2 weeks later was also destroyed. For the British commanders, the war had shifted from a platoon commander's problem into a company commander's problem, and the Indonesians were now committing their best regular infantry, Marines, and paratroops. Walker could see the flaw in his own system, and it was structural rather than tactical. He was winning almost every engagement and losing the campaign, because the Indonesians could concentrate, rest, plan, and rehearse in complete safety on their own side of a line his soldiers were forbidden to cross, and then choose the time and place of every fight. They held the initiative permanently. The security forces held only the right to respond. In a border war of that length, against an enemy with unlimited sanctuary, responding forever is another name for losing slowly. Walker began asking for permission to cross. He got it in stages, and the stages reveal exactly how frightened London was of what it was authorising. In April of 1964, the British Prime Minister, Sir Alec Douglas Home, cabled the Australian Prime Minister, Sir Robert Menzies, to inform him that Commonwealth forces in Borneo could pursue the enemy across the Indonesian border to a depth of 3,000 yards. Hot pursuit is a defensive concept dressed in aggressive language. By August, after the Johor landing, the permission changed character completely. Raids of an offensive nature into Indonesian territory were authorised, and the depth extended to 5,000 yards. Then, in a cable of the 15th of January, 1965, Prime Minister Harold Wilson informed the acting Australian Prime Minister, John McEwen, that operations could run up to 10,000 yards inside Kalimantan, just under 6 miles, deep enough to sit on an enemy supply river and stay there for a week. The code name for all of it was Claret, and it worked because Walker treated secrecy not as an administrative burden, but as the primary weapon of the entire concept. Since the public policy of every Commonwealth government involved was that its soldiers did not cross the border, deniability was not a convenience. It was the operation. And deniability, Walker understood, did not depend on lying well. It depended on the Indonesians being physically unable to produce proof. So he wrote a set of restrictions known throughout the campaign as the Golden Rules, and they were obeyed with a rigour that reads today as something close to fanaticism. Every mission had to be personally authorised by the Director of Borneo Operations himself. Only troops who had already completed a full tour in Borneo were eligible, which excluded almost every fresh reinforcement in the theatre and kept the number of raids permanently low. Penetration depth was capped, and raids were sanctioned only to forestall enemy offensive action, never as retribution for casualties already suffered. Civilian lives were not to be risked under any circumstances, because a dead villager is a witness with relatives. No air support would be given across the border except in the most extreme emergency, since a Commonwealth aircraft over Kalimantan is evidence that no denial can survive. Each operation had to be planned against a sand table and rehearsed for at least a fortnight, with artillery targets plotted silently, meaning without ranging shots that would announce anything to anyone. Every man was sworn to secrecy, every mission given a code name, and no detail was ever to be discussed on a telephone or a radio. Identity discs were removed and left behind before departure. Nothing manufactured was to be abandoned in Indonesian territory. No cartridge cases, no ration wrappers, no paper, nothing at all. The last rule, the one that hung over every patrol that ever went across, was that on no account was any soldier to fall into enemy hands, alive or dead. Read that final rule again slowly, because it is not a slogan. It is a logistical instruction. It means that if a man was killed 6 miles inside Indonesia, his body had to be carried out on the backs of the men who had been walking beside him, through swamp and secondary jungle, over ridgelines, for however many days it took, because leaving him was not an option that existed. In the entire campaign, only one casualty evacuation by helicopter from inside Kalimantan is recorded. Everything else came out the hard way, or did not come out. The concealment regime that resulted was among the most effective ever built around an ongoing military campaign, and the geography did half the work. The border was reachable only by helicopter or small boat, and the military controlled both. Combat troops were kept well away from anything resembling a town. At the Far East Land Forces headquarters in Singapore, the need-to-know principle was enforced so rigidly that officers working at adjacent desks for months could remain ignorant of what the other was doing. A great many of the men conducting the raids spoke Gurkhali as their first language, which defeated casual eavesdropping without anyone having to try. Any journalist wanting to investigate the border had to rely on the security forces for both his information and his transport. There was no way in. On the 12th of March, 1965, Walker handed over to Major General George Leah, who had commanded 22nd SAS for 3 years during the Malayan emergency. Leah inherited a force of some 20,000 men and an enemy build-up that had reached the point of open menace. British intelligence assessed that more than 22,000 Indonesian troops would be in position along the border by February, in roughly 50 regular and 20 irregular companies, with the paracommandos of the RPKD and the men of the Diponegoro Division concentrated opposite the 1st Division of Sarawak and the road to Kuching. 6 weeks after Leah took command, the Indonesians settled the question for him. In the last days of April, At 5 minutes past 5 in the morning, on a night the survivors described as very dark and streaming with rain. 2 companies of Indonesian paratroopers with a third in reserve assaulted the B Company base at Plamen Mapu, held by the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment. Every previous attack of this kind had gone for a longhouse, or the edge of a village. This one went straight for the company position, which that night was held by a weak platoon of cooks, storemen and signallers, because the fighting men were out on patrol where fighting men are supposed to be. The attackers knocked out a mortar and a machine gun in the opening minutes. Then the British paratroopers recovered and fought them off the wire, inflicting losses one estimate puts at half the attacking battalion. The base held. But the message was unmistakable. The Indonesians had just tried to overrun a company position. They intended to keep raising the stakes, and nothing happening on the Malaysian side of the line was going to deter them. Into that campaign, late and reluctantly, came the Australians. Canberra had allowed its battalions in the Far East Strategic Reserve to defend the Malayan Peninsula, and Australian troops had mopped up the Indonesian landings near Labis and Pontian in late 1964. But it had resisted committing forces to Borneo itself. In January of 1965, it gave way, agreeing to send an infantry battalion, an artillery battery, an engineer construction squadron, and, for the first time in the history of the unit, a squadron of the Special Air Service Regiment. Worth noting what else that decision produced at home. Australian anxiety about Indonesian intentions was one of the principal reasons the government reintroduced selective national service. The conscription ballot that would define Australian politics for a decade was not created for Vietnam. It was created for the country whose territory Australian soldiers were about to enter without permission and without acknowledgement. The 3rd Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, moved from Camp Terendak in Malacca and formally relieved the 1st Battalion of the 7th Gurkha Rifles in the BAU district of Western Sarawak on the 22nd of March 1965. It carried the deepest possible pedigree, the battalion that had fought at Kapyong and at Mariang San in Korea, and lost 231 men killed there, and it was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Bruce MacDonald. He put battalion headquarters and D Company at BAU, and pushed his 3 other rifle companies forward onto the border, a company at Stas, B Company at Bukit Knuckle, C Company at Serikin. Each company held on average a frontage of around 7,700 yards of jungle. Behind them stood the guns of the British 4th Light Regiment, with 105mm pack howitzers and 5.5-inch mediums, and alongside those the 102nd Field Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery, whose official task was defensive fire for Commonwealth outposts, and whose actual task, a great deal of the time, was supporting operations in a country the battery was not allowed to fire into. Kuching, the capital, lay 31 miles behind them. Nothing stood between the Indonesians and that city except these men. Across the border were 2 Indonesian battalion combat teams of the 5th Brigade, with a 3rd concentrated further east, some 3,050 men in total, under the command of Colonel Sujono, supported by at least 2 artillery detachments with anti-aircraft machine guns used in the ground role and 81mm mortars. These were not irregular volunteers. These were among the best formations in the Indonesian order of battle, and there were roughly 4 of them for every Australian rifleman on that stretch of frontier. The Special Air Service arrived separately and earlier. The advance party of one squadron flew into Brunei on the 16th of February, 1965, with the remainder disembarking from a ship 2 days later. It was the first operational deployment in the regiment's history, and the squadron commander was Major Alf Garland, born in Sydney in March of 1932, a career veteran who had joined the army at 19, and who would go on to Vietnam, to the rank of brigadier, and eventually to the national presidency of the Returned and Services League. At Tutong, the squadron spent 4 weeks being taken apart and rebuilt. Everything the Australians had trained for was based on platoon-sized infantry tactics, which is to say, on 30 men doing things loudly and quickly. British instructors now taught them the method 22nd SAS had developed over 2 years in Borneo. 4 men, weeks at a time in the jungle, no contact, no noise, no trace, and a standing order that if you are seen, you shoot once and run, rather than fight. One squadron mounted more than 60 patrols before it went home. The jungle itself deserves its own paragraph, because it did more damage to the Australians than the Indonesian army ever managed. This was mountainous primary and secondary rainforest, ridgelines and swamp, saturated by monsoon, thick with leeches and disease, and rivers that could rise from ankle depth to a killing torrent in a matter of hours. Men walked for days to reach a start line. They carried everything in and everything out. They cooked nothing that produced smoke and buried nothing they could carry. A patrol commander from the 4th Battalion later described a routine 12-day operation, of which 11 days were spent inside Indonesia. Every yard of that was walked, and the jungle, not the enemy, killed the first Australian Special Forces soldier to die on active service. Lance Corporal Paul Denehey was born in Victoria on the 21st of January, 1944. He enlisted on the 22nd of February, 1962, into the Royal Australian Corps of Signals, was posted to the Special Air Service at Swanbourne in Western Australia on the 13th of August, 1963, and qualified as a Special Forces soldier the following year. He wrote home as often as the mail allowed, to his parents and to his brothers and sisters. On the 24th of May, 1965, he went out as the signaller of a 4-man patrol tasked with gathering intelligence on a known Indonesian infiltration route. The patrol followed the border for a week, crossed into Kalimantan, then followed a river for 2 days more. On the afternoon of the 2nd of June, crossing a ridgeline above the Selimulan River, they disturbed a rogue bull elephant with a broken tusk. It charged. The patrol scattered and fired at it, and the shots did nothing. 3 men got clear. Denehey, a tall man, was caught trying to vault a fallen log, gored under the ribcage by the broken tusk and thrown into the air. The patrol medic, Lance Corporal Stephen Bloomfield, went to work on him while the others cut a stretcher. Then the golden rules closed around those 4 men like a trap. The patrol radio was damaged and could transmit but not receive, so they had no way of knowing whether their signals were reaching anyone. No helicopter could enter Indonesian airspace to lift him, because a Commonwealth aircraft over Kalimantan was the single thing the entire architecture of Claret existed to prevent. The terrain made carrying him out impossible for a party that size. So the patrol commander and 1 other man set off on foot for the extraction point to find help, and were stalked by the elephant along the way and had to evade it in the dark. The 3rd man stayed until his medical supplies ran out, and then left to look for assistance too. Help came. It came too late. Paul Denehey died somewhere in that jungle between the 5th and the 7th of June, 1965, alone, of a wound that would have been survivable within an hour of a surgeon. The army recorded his date of death as the 6th. He was 21 years old. He was buried with full military honours at the Ulu Pandan Military Cemetery in Singapore on the 12th of June, and when that cemetery was closed for development in the early 1970s, he was reinterred at Kranji, in Plot 11, Row C, Grave 15, where he remains. His family have been campaigning to bring him home to Australia for decades. Australian newspapers reported at the time, accurately as far as it went, that a soldier had been killed by a wild elephant on patrol near the Sabah border. They did not report which side of that border he had been on, because nobody was allowed to say. 6 days before Denehey was gored, the war the Australian infantry had come to fight had already begun in earnest, and it began with a piece of tradecraft so patient it barely resembles combat. On the 24th of May, 5 platoon and 11 platoon of B Company, with a forward observation party, walked out of the company base at Bukit Knuckle under the command of Major William Broderick, and the mission was codenamed Article. The objective was an ambush on the bank of the Sungei Koemba, one of the rivers the Indonesians used to move men and supplies to their forward camps. It took 2 days of laborious movement through thick jungle to get into position. On the 26th, Broderick established a patrol base on high ground above the river and sent Lieutenant Patrick Beale forward with a reconnaissance party of 3 men. Beale found, in a re-entrant below him, a group of Indonesian soldiers talking loudly and firing random shots into the trees, with no security of any kind, unaware that Australians were within 100 yards of them. They were that confident. Nobody had ever given them a reason not to be. The following morning, Broderick moved down the spur to establish a firm base while Beale brought 5 platoon forward. They crossed a track, and beyond it lay the river, and to the north, across a shallow creek, the Indonesians could still be heard moving about their camp. They were too close. Bringing more men forward risked detection, so Beale split what he had, putting 2 Bren guns covering the track to secure that flank and the rest of the platoon on a bend in the river. The bend narrowed to about 33 yards. Only 1 man in the entire ambush could see around it, the sentry on the extreme right, Private Lawrence Jackson. They had been in position for 40 minutes when they heard outboard motors. At 32 minutes past 11 in the morning, on the 27th of May, 1965, 2 10-foot motorboats came into view, each carrying 5 armed and uniformed Indonesian soldiers, and among them 1 fair-haired European, later assessed to have been a Dutch mercenary. The Australians let them come. At a range of 38 yards, they opened fire and emptied both boats in seconds. The first sank. The second drifted away downstream. 2 men swimming for the far bank were shot in the water. Nobody in that ambush knew there had been 4 boats, not 2. As the third came round the bend, it appeared directly in front of the only man positioned to see it, and Jackson killed all 5 of its occupants at a range of 11 yards. 11 yards. The 4th boat drove hard for the near shore, out of everyone else's line of sight, and Jackson engaged it alone with 2 grenades and rifle fire until his weapon jammed. Had he not been where he was, that boatload of Indonesians would have landed on the same bank as the Australians and come in behind them while the platoon was still facing the river. From first shot to that moment, 2 minutes had passed. Roughly 10 Indonesians on the far bank now opened up with heavy but wildly inaccurate automatic fire. Beale broke contact and pulled back to 11 platoon. The forward observation officer dropped artillery onto the position they had just abandoned to suppress any pursuit, and an Indonesian mortar began firing into empty jungle in entirely the wrong direction. Elements of D Company and Support Company had been deployed inside Sarawak to cover the withdrawal. B Company was back at Bukit Knuckle that evening, having killed at least 15 men, and quite possibly more, without a single Australian casualty. That night, Indonesian radio announced the training accident and the 23 dead. Consider what that broadcast reveals, because it is the strangest thing in this entire story. The Indonesian High Command knew perfectly well that Commonwealth troops were operating inside Kalimantan. Their generals simply could not afford to admit it, because admitting it meant telling Sukarno that the army was losing a war it had assured him it was winning, and the political enemies of those generals were already accusing them of dragging their feet. So the deception ran in both directions at once. Britain and Australia lied to their own publics because the truth would have handed Sukarno a propaganda victory, made the Indonesian position a matter of national prestige, and closed off any route to a negotiated end. Indonesia lied to its own public because the truth would have exposed the failure of its army and cost its generals their position. Two governments on opposite sides of a shooting war, each maintaining the other's cover story, for exactly opposite reasons. In the space between those two lies, thousands of men were fighting, and some of them were dying, in a place that on paper had no fighting in it at all. Lieutenant Patrick Beale received the Military Cross for his personal bravery, leadership, judgment, and skill. Private Lawrence Jackson received the Military Medal, his citation recording that his complete disregard for his own safety had prevented the Indonesians landing on the near bank and attacking the rest of the ambush party. Both awards were gazetted in London on the 10th of December, 1965. Neither citation could say where any of it had happened. June became the most intensive and the most successful month of the Australian Battalion's tour. On the 10th, 7 Platoon of C Company under Lieutenant Robert Guest, accompanied by the company commander Major Ivor Hodgkinson, the battalion intelligence officer, and a fire control party, left Serikin for a mission codenamed Fawn Fair. The target was the Koemba again, further downstream and closer to the Indonesian positions at Seeding. They occupied the ambush position early the next morning and waited. 2 boats carrying civilians came past during the day and were allowed through untouched. 3 more the following morning, also civilians, also allowed to pass. Those are the golden rules in practice, and it is worth pausing on how much easier and safer the alternative would have been for the men lying in that mud. At 11:15 on the 12th of June, the sentry on the left flank, Private Haynes, saw an Indonesian foot patrol coming along the riverbank. The ambush had been laid to engage boats and was badly angled for men on land. 10 minutes later, Private Snedden, on the extreme left, opened up on a group of 6 with a long burst of machine gun fire, killing 2 instantly and a third as he ran forward. Haynes killed a 4th. The rest kept coming, pushing past the flank and towards the rear of the Australian position, which is the moment ambushes turn into disasters. Hodgkinson worked his way left into the line of their approach and killed 2 more and wounded a 3rd. Guest gathered the right-hand elements of his platoon, hooked around his own company commander, and counter-attacked. 20 minutes after it began, it was over. The Australians stripped the position of weapons and equipment, including an automatic rifle, 3 American rifles and 200 rounds of ammunition, and identified the dead by their kit as men of the 440th Battalion. 8 Indonesians killed, 1 seriously wounded, no Australian casualties. Hodgkinson was later appointed a member of the Order of the British Empire for his command of C Company, in terms referring to the highest qualities expected of professional soldiers and naming no country whatever. 3 days later came the largest and the most dangerous of them all. Acting on a reconnaissance report that the Indonesians had increased their use of a track southwest of SAS, 2 platoon of a company, with a forward observation party, had gone out on the 12th of June, hours after the Fawn Fair ambush, under 2nd Lieutenant Douglas Byers. The mission was codenamed Blockbuster. They laid up astride the track in thick swampy jungle, 1,300 metres inside Kalimantan, with a firm base of 6 men to the rear, 3 men securing the right flank across a small creek, 4 men and claymore mines in cut-off 75 metres to the west, a killing group of 14 men in the centre, and the forward observer and a 2-inch mortar positioned in depth. Their task was to intercept an Indonesian force believed to have already infiltrated into Sarawak and catch it on the way home. That evening they lay in the swamp and listened to Indonesian mortars shelling their own company base at Stas, and did nothing, because doing anything would have compromised the position. They stayed there in silence for 3 days. At 26 minutes past 1 in the afternoon on the 15th of June, 1965, they saw the Indonesians coming from the east, walking close together in single file with their weapons slung across their shoulders, in green uniforms and American steel helmets and webbing, carrying Armalite rifles. Byers let about 25 of them walk into the killing area and then initiated the ambush with a burst from his own submachine gun. At least 12 went down in the opening seconds. The 3 leading Indonesians had already walked clear before it started and ran west along the track, straight into the claymores of the cut-off party, and died where they stood. Then the situation reversed. The column was not 25 men. It was closer to 100, and Byers had caught only the head of it. The rest deployed off the track and came on with machine gun and mortar fire and a number of grenades that failed to explode. 30 Australians were now in contact with 3 times their number, 1,300 metres inside Indonesia, with no air support permitted, no possibility of reinforcement, and a withdrawal route running back through a mile of swamp. They killed the Indonesian machine gun with rifle fire, taking 1 man wounded in the knee. Australian counter-battery fire silenced the Indonesian mortars. 17 bodies were counted in front of the position, with another 7 wounded visible, and the Australians believed the true figure was closer to 25. Then the forward observer began working. 105mm and 5.5-inch shells came down onto the Indonesian positions, onto the men wounded in the ambush, and onto the larger party that came up the track to investigate the noise. By 1:45, Byers was withdrawing, carrying 1 wounded man, with a second walking despite shrapnel in his thigh. They were across the border by 4 o'clock and back at SAS the following day. Total Indonesian losses were later estimated as high as 50 killed, most of them to the guns. Subsequent intelligence established that the Indonesian unit had only just arrived at Kindau and was on its first operation of the war. Byers received the Military Cross. The commanding officer of the 4th Light Regiment recorded the effectiveness of his gunners in the only terms that carry any weight in an army, which was that afterwards the infantry bought them far too much beer. Then Kindau did something none of the previous actions had done. It leaked. A journalist got into the British military hospital in Singapore and interviewed one of the 2 wounded Australians. For the first time in the campaign, an Australian cross-border action was going to appear in a newspaper. The machine absorbed it without breaking stride. The story ran. The location given was Sarawak. The wounded man had been hurt inside Malaysian territory, defending the border, exactly as the public policy of 3 governments said he must have been. The fiction held, as it held for every Commonwealth casualty of the entire war, because that was the standing procedure and always had been. Casualties suffered beyond the border were reported as having occurred in Malaysia. A soldier shot 6,000 yards inside Indonesia came home in the records as a soldier shot on his own side of a line he had crossed a week earlier. His family were told the truth about his wound and a lie about his war. Leia ordered a short pause after Kindau to watch what the enemy would do. The enemy stopped. Heavy Indonesian mortaring of Australian company bases, which had continued through May and June, ceased almost entirely. There is the whole theory of Claret vindicated in a single observable behaviour. An enemy who has to worry about his own supply lines loses the spare capacity to shell yours. The last of the 4 came on the 12th of July, 1965, at Babang, where 7 platoon of C Company under Guest, with Hodgkinson alongside him again, occupied an ambush position on a well-used track near an Indonesian base. Around midday, a force of about 30 Indonesians came down the track and was ambushed. This time, the survivors counterattacked with real determination, and the Australians pulled back under defensive artillery fire. 13 Indonesians were killed and 5 wounded. No Australians were lost. That ended it for the 3rd Battalion. It completed its tour in August and returned to Camp Terendak. In 4 months, it had conducted 32 Claret operations, 12 of them reconnaissance patrols, and 20 of them ambushes or fighting patrols, most producing no contact at all, because most cross-border patrolling produces nothing but exhaustion. In the 4 that did produce contact, it inflicted somewhere between 60 and 90 fatalities on an enemy who outnumbered it locally and outgunned it. In nothing except confidence, and it never lost a man in any of them. It lost 3 men in Borneo altogether. All 3 were killed by mines the Indonesians had laid on the Malaysian side of the border. War reserves that particular joke for units that have done everything right. By the autumn, the campaign was already turning. On the 30th of September, 1965, a failed coup attempt in Jakarta destroyed the political balance Sukarno had spent a decade maintaining, and the Indonesian army turned inward to conduct a massacre of communists and suspected communists that would eventually kill hundreds of thousands of people. Leah, wanting as little killing on his own front as the situation allowed, twice ordered pauses in cross-border raids, and twice found that the moment the pressure came off, the incursions resumed and he had to turn the pressure back on. There is the pattern of the entire final year, and it is the clearest evidence anyone could ask for that Claret was doing the work. The degree of political control was, by any normal military standard, extraordinary. In late March of 1966, an entire Gurkha battalion was inside Kalimantan, with 4 of its 5 companies in the process of surrounding an Indonesian base when the order came to break off. Peace feelers had been extended in secret to Kuala Lumpur. The battalion was permitted to fire an artillery mission and nothing else, and then it walked home. A campaign that can be halted in mid-encirclement by a diplomatic signal from another continent is not really a military operation. It is a foreign policy instrument that happens to be made of infantry. 2 squadron of the Australian SAS arrived at Kuching in February of 1966, into a strategic situation that had changed completely. Its commander was Major Jim Hughes, who had won a military cross in Korea, fought the Malayan emergency alongside the British, and taught at Sandhurst. He was short and slight, and by every account of the men who served under him, as tough as leather. His squadron ran patrols across the border under orders that increasingly emphasized avoiding contact altogether, because the last thing anyone wanted while negotiations were running was a firefight requiring an explanation. It made no difference to the country itself. On the 21st of March, 1966, a 4-man Australian patrol attempted to cross the Sungei River in Kalimantan in darkness and driving rain, with the river in flood. Lieutenant Ken Hudson and Private Bob Moncrief were swept away and drowned. The remaining 2 troopers survived and walked out of the jungle on their own. They were the 2nd and 3rd Australian Special Forces soldiers to die on operations, and, like Paul Denehey, they died where their own government had stated they had never been. Under the last of the Golden Rules, nobody was ever going to be able to mount a proper search for them. The 4th Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, had taken over the BAU district in April of 1966, with 30 national servicemen among its ranks, who became the first Australian conscripts of the era to serve on operations anywhere in the world. Its official record shows it remaining on the Malaysian side of the border throughout its tour, patrolling and ambushing the tracks that led down from the frontier, and never once crossing. Brian Avery, who commanded a rifle platoon in that battalion, and who spent years afterwards assembling its history, has stated flatly that this is false. He went across on more than one occasion, he says, as did many others. The reports sent back to Canberra were doctored. 2 versions were written for every patrol, one recording 12 days of walking in circles inside Sarawak, and one recording the 11 days actually spent in Indonesia, and only the first version ever left the theatre. He says that at the time, only the Prime Minister, Harold Holt, and his Defence Minister were told what was really happening, and that visiting parliamentary delegations were shown maps drawn specifically to keep Australian soldiers on the correct side of a line they were crossing every week. His explanation for all of it is a single observation about diplomacy, and it is unanswerable. "It was a strange situation," he said, "in which you are fighting someone while maintaining full diplomatic relations with them, and that must be very rare." Cross-border operations were suspended on the 28th of May, 1966, 3 days after Indonesian officers representing General Suharto met Malaysian government representatives face to face. On the 3rd of June, Indonesian radio announced the end of the confrontation. In the interval between those two announcements, on the 15th of June, 1966, with the war finished in every sense except the legal one, C Company of the 4th Battalion fought 2 separate contacts, pushing an Indonesian party into an ambush and killing 4 of them. Private Vic Richards was shot in the stomach. He was evacuated to Singapore and died there 5 days later, of a wound taken in a war already declared over, in a country nobody would name for a generation. He was the battalion's only combat fatality. Lieutenant Rodney Curtis of 9 Platoon received the Military Cross for cool leadership, bravery, judgment and determination in leading 9 men to block the enemy withdrawal during that action, and Corporal Anderson the Military Medal. The peace treaty between Malaysia and Indonesia was signed on the 11th of August 1966. Commonwealth operations ceased the following day. By any measure available, the strategy had worked. The Indonesians lost 590 men killed by their own admission, with the true figure believed considerably higher because the victims of cross-border raids could not always be counted, along with 222 wounded and 771 captured. Commonwealth security forces lost 114 killed and 181 wounded, with a further 36 civilians killed and 53 wounded. 4 years of war against the regular army of the 5th most populous country on earth, concluded at a cost in Commonwealth lives smaller than a single bad afternoon on the Western Front. Denis Healey, who as Secretary of State for Defence had authorised the whole thing, later described the Borneo campaign as a textbook demonstration of how to apply economy of force under political guidance for political ends. There is a further argument, harder to prove and more interesting. Because the raids were deniable, and because the Indonesian generals had every reason to preserve the deniability, Sukarno himself may never have learned that by the middle of 1965, his soldiers had effectively stopped operating inside Malaysian Borneo. The army had no incentive to tell him. Its failure looked, to the Communist Party, like deliberate foot-dragging, and that suspicion widened the fracture between Sukarno and his generals that eventually swallowed him. Secrecy, in other words, may not merely have concealed the victory, it may have caused it, and the secrecy that made it work is precisely what buried it. Britain did not publicly acknowledge the existence of Claret operations until 1974, 8 years after the last patrol came home. Australia did not officially acknowledge its own involvement until 1996, when the relevant cabinet papers were finally released. 30 years. When the official history of Australia's involvement in Southeast Asian conflicts was being assembled, its editor, Peter Edwards, had to actively persuade the government to allow the confrontation into the series at all. That is how close this campaign came to never being written down by anyone. The men were released from the Official Secrets Act in 1996, and most of them stayed silent anyway, because 30 years of not saying a thing is a habit that does not come off. When Avery began interviewing veterans for his book, the most consistent thing he encountered was men telling him, with complete sincerity, that their platoon had been the only one to cross the border. Sit with that for a moment. They had kept the secret so well that they had kept it from each other. For 3 decades, each of these men privately believed he had been part of an exception rather than part of a campaign, that whatever he had done in Kalimantan was an anomaly rather than a system, and that nobody else alive would understand it. Successful operational security is one way to describe that. Another is 30 years of men carrying something alone that they never needed to carry alone. because the rule telling them to keep carrying it was never switched off. What that produced, in the end, is a hole in a country's memory of itself. Australian fatalities from the Borneo Commitment between March of 1965 and August of 1966 included 4 men of the 21st and 22nd Construction Squadrons, 3 soldiers of the Special Air Service, 3 from the 3rd Battalion, and 5 from the 4th. Across the whole confrontation, 23 Australians did not come home. 3,000 Australians served in that conflict, and the national story runs in almost every history, every documentary, and every monument in the country, straight from Korea into Vietnam, with nothing whatsoever in between. Konfrontasi fills that gap exactly. It is not in the narrative, because for 30 years putting it there was a criminal offence, and by the time it stopped being one, the decade had already been written without them. In 2020, Brian Selby, a Borneo veteran and a state president of the Australian Malaya and Borneo Veterans Association, applied to Australia Post for a commemorative stamp. He was asking for a rectangle of adhesive paper measuring 37.5mm by 26. The application was refused on the grounds that commemorative issues must mark anniversaries of 50 years, or multiples of 50. The 50th had passed in 2016. The next falls in 2066. Selby was 75 years old when he was told this, and his answer was that the rule could be changed overnight if anyone wanted to change it, and that what the veterans wanted was recognition, primarily for the 23 men who never came back. Among the people who received that news was Vicky Tiggs, 6 months old when her father, Barry Algar, was killed on service, and now years into a committee raising money for a proper memorial. Asked about the stamp, she did not talk about stamps. She talked about the calculation that governs everything now, which is that the veterans are not getting any younger, and the longer this takes, the fewer of them will still be alive to know that what they did was valued. Anzac Parade in Canberra carries a memorial to every conflict Australia has fought. It carries memorials to the horses and to the dogs. It does not carry one to the confrontation. The National Capital Authority, which administers the parade, has observed that such memorials are generally funded by veterans groups and volunteers, and that in this instance there does not appear to have been the same impetus to build one. True enough, and a complete inversion of cause and effect. There was no impetus because there was no story. There was no story because the story was a secret, and secrets do not generate committees. Paul Denehey lies at Kranji, in Singapore. 6 decades after a rogue elephant found him on a ridgeline he was not supposed to be standing on. Ken Hudson and Bob Moncrief went into the Sungei River in the dark and never came out of Kalimantan at all. Vic Richards died in a Singapore hospital of a wound taken 12 days after his war was declared to be over. Patrick Beale, Douglas Byers and Rodney Curtis were awarded 3 military crosses for actions in a country their citations could not name, and Lawrence Jackson a military medal for 11 yards of river he was never supposed to have seen. The operations worked. The soldiers were superb, and they were commanded by men who understood their business as well as anyone in the history of that kind of warfare. The governments they served concluded, for reasons genuinely defensible at the time and simply never revisited afterwards, that the most useful thing these men could do for their countries was to disappear. The men agreed. Then they went on agreeing for 3 decades, with a discipline nobody outside that jungle has ever been asked to demonstrate, and their country, having asked them to vanish, forgot to come back for them. Indonesian radio said 23 men had died in a training accident. Canberra said its soldiers had walked in circles inside Malaysia. Somewhere between those 2 sentences is what happened on the Sungei Koemba on the 27th of May, 1965, and on a track outside Kindau on the 15th of June, and on a ridgeline above the Selimulan River, and in a flooded river in the dark in March. None of it is recorded on any monument in the capital of the country whose soldiers did it. If you believe those men deserve to be remembered, leave a comment below. And if you want to understand how the most successful counterinsurgency campaign of the 20th century was erased by the very secrecy that made it work, watch this next.